Today we are extremely excited to bring you tonight's program with a really distinguished panel of experts. And our experts are going to be providing some current insights in one of America's most important alliances, the U.S. Japan Alliance. This program would not have been possible without our national partner and co-host for this program tonight, Sasakawa USA. And we are very fortunate to have the staff of Sasakawa USA join us from DC. So at this time, I would really like them to stand if they are here, if we can recognize them for all of their work. Thank you. Now, this program is one of 4 in Sasakawa's series, The Alliance Working in America. This series highlights the cultural, economic, and educational relationships that's built around this U.S. Japan Alliance. Tonight, we are also very happy to have another distinguished guest in the audience, the Consul General of Japan in Nashville, Mr. Hiroyuki Kobayashi. And the Consul General will be staying with us for the reception, at which time he will give us some remarks. So I encourage all of you to stick around for that. And then finally, but certainly not least, I am very delighted to welcome the President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America, Mr. Bill Clifford. WACA traces its roots back to 1918. And now has over about 90 councils throughout the U.S., including our council here in Louisville, Kentucky. And then Bill has led this big network for many years, since 2013, and has helped us bring a lot of great programs to our council here in Louisville, Kentucky. So having worked with Bill on the board of WACA, I am so happy to welcome him to Louisville for the very first time. And I would like to now ask Bill to come up and introduce our program and our panelists tonight. Bill?
Good evening, and thank you very much, Xiaoyan. I should say that the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana is a great asset for this community, but you really have a national asset here in Xiaoyan, because not only has she developed these programs for you and is great to work with, she has been a really excellent advisor to me on the national board, and I appreciate that and the opportunity to be here for the first time in Kentucky. As Xiaoyan said, the World Affairs Councils of America has partnered with Sasakawa USA on a few other programs. We've facilitated one in Houston, in Portland, Oregon, and also late last fall in Atlanta, rather in September. And so these are the kinds of programs that we really believe in, because we want to foster collaboration with our international partners. We want to be able to dialogue in a civil way. And the other thing that World Affairs Councils do is, we think, promote domestic tranquility. We try to allow all sides of the issues to come to the fore without polarizing them. So this is a true opportunity. I'm going to introduce, I'm going to bring the people who will be speaking to you tonight to the stage and introduce them once they are here. So why don't I call up Kevin Smith. Kevin? Kevin is the director of the Kentucky Chamber Executive Board, and he's on the governor's, he's on the governor's Kentucky Workforce Innovation Board, where he chairs the Business Engagement Committee. Dr. Satu Limay. Satu is the executive director of the East-West Center in Washington, and he's a senior advisor for the CNA Corporation, a nonprofit research and analysis organization. He also is the creator and director of the Asia Matters for America series, which is both in print and interactive online, and this is the new Japan Matters for America series, and it is a valuable resource which we include in the World Affairs Council's high school program, Academic World Quest, which Kentucky supports. Next, I'd like to bring up thank you, Satu. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Toshiro Nakayama to the stage. Welcome. Dr. Nakayama is the Japan Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C. He's also a professor of American politics and foreign policy at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University, one of the top private universities in Japan. And way back in 1993, I think our paths crossed as journalists. He was in the Washington Post Bureau when I was at the Japan Nikkei Weekly. Thank you. Last but not least, Ambassador James Zumwalt. Jim, it's been a pleasure to work with you on the Alliances Working in Japan and the U.S. program. Joined Sasakawa USA as Chief Executive Officer in February 2017, so for just over 2 years. But before that, he had a distinguished 36-year career in the Foreign Service, almost as long as Kevin was doing bourbon whiskey. And one distinction, in addition to capping that career as ambassador to Senegal and Guinea-Bissau, Jim was there at a crucial moment when the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami hit virtually 8 years ago. 5 days from now will be the 8th anniversary of that tragic event, and Jim coordinated the U.S. support for our ally, Japan. So this is a distinguished panel that I'm pleased to bring to you with the local council. And also I just want to acknowledge Consul General Kobayashi again for coming up from Nashville. We're so pleased that you can work with our Tennessee chapter as well, and thank you all for being here tonight. Enjoy the panel.
No, thank you very much for coming this evening, and thank you, Bill, for the wonderful introduction. And I did want to thank the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana for being such wonderful partners. One other thing I've heard is I believe there's some students in the audience. Could I ask the students in the audience to raise their hands? Okay. If you could look around, because I think one of the really nice things about events like this is for students to have a chance to interact with people that got there. So if you wouldn't mind looking around, and if you identify someone who's a student, please afterwards, if you could maybe talk to them about the careers you've chosen, because I think for a student it's a wonderful opportunity to learn a lot about opportunities in foreign affairs. So thank you very much for hosting that. I'm going to be very brief because we have a very exciting panel, but if there's one thing I hope you'll take away from this discussion today, it's that Japan really is a natural partner for the United States. It makes sense for us to partner with Japan, and the reason is because the United States and Japan share common values. We're both democracies, we believe in human rights and the rule of law, and so it makes sense as we're conducting our own diplomacy to partner with a like-minded nation like Japan. Our security alliance with Japan has endured since 1960 because in addition to these common values, we share common interests. We want to see a free and open region. We're interested in promoting regional prosperity because that's good for both countries. So often in my 36-year career in the Foreign Service, when we were looking around for partners to work together, Japan was one of the countries at the very top of the list. So today, I'm very excited that we're going to have a discussion about Japan. And I think we'll first ask maybe Dr. Nakayama, who is a distinguished America scholar. Most of his job in Japan is explaining the United States to a Japanese audience. But today we're going to ask you to turn your hat around. And if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit first about how is Japan looking at the United States today, and what are some of the challenges you see from a Japanese perspective for our relationship?
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Zumwalt, for that question. And it's really great to be here in Kentucky. You know, Northeast Asia is a very complex region, right? And as a globe, we share, you know, global warming, pandemics, cyber threats, and all that. But in Northeast Asia, there's a serious, you know, struggle or competition among the great powers. And Japan cannot cope with those, you know, situation alone. So we need a good partner. And of course, when we talk about this great power competition, it's mainly about the rise of China. Of course, in the short term, North Korea is a very serious issue. But in the long term, it's where China is going. It may turn out positive. It may not. We don't know. So in order to sort of shape China's rise, we need U.S. as a serious partner. So I think, generally speaking, Japan is a strong supporter of U.S. presence in Asia Pacific, and that's critical, always critical for Japan.
No, thank you very much. You did, in your remarks, mention North Korea, which has been in the news recently because of the recent summit in Vietnam. But could you give us some insights in how Japanese people are seeing the U.S.-North Korea relationship? What are the concerns?
Well, in a word, we're really worried. Of course, things on the North Korean side as well as the U.S. side, because it's unpredictable. And it's good that our Prime Minister has a very good personal chemistry and personal relation with Mr. Trump, President Trump. So at least we can, through Prime Minister Abe, we can try to understand the American side, sort of thinking on the American side. But that's a bit unusual, right? You have to communicate through the top level. So at the bureaucratic level, as you were like in Tokyo, I don't think that connection is as strong as it was before. So we are a bit worried. Of course, we are more worried what the North Koreans are doing, but we are so unsure how the U.S. side is approaching things that makes us a bit nervous. And I think that's the kind of situation right now.
And could you comment a little more on the relationship between the Japanese Prime Minister and the U.S. President? It seems to me that we've had periods before, for example, when Prime Minister Koizumi had a very close relationship with President Bush, but it seems to me that relationship, there was a lot of criticism in Japan about the Prime Minister being too close to the United States.
Right.
And I think today, maybe I don't hear that as much, but could you comment a little bit on how the Japanese people see that relationship?
Right. There was also Nakasone, Prime Minister Nakasone, and Prime Minister Reagan.
President Reagan.
President Reagan, and Bush Koizumi. And I think it's fundamentally different in case of Prime Minister Abe and President Trump. I don't know whether there's genuine personal chemistry. I do not know. But I think there's a clear sort of determination and understanding on the Japanese side that no matter who the president is, if you think about the situation that we're facing in Northeast Asia, and especially you have to look back on what Mr. Trump said about Japan during the election. He said Japan is a cheater in terms of trade. He said that in terms of security, Japan is a free rider. And also, he said that Japan can go nuclear if you want. So that was the kind of message. But that was a sort of an election campaign message. But and it didn't turn out that way. But since he was saying that, we were extremely worried. So at the like January 2017, there was a clear determination on the Japanese side that we would hug this president. We would embrace him no matter what. So I would say it's a strategic hugging on the Japanese side. And I think it's been working, right? Up until now, at least.
At least so far, yes.
So far, right.
And finally, you mentioned the long-range concerns Japan has about the rise of China. At the same time, there's a vibrant economic relationship between Japanese business community and China as well. So there seems to be somewhat of an ambivalence, maybe. But could you comment a little more on Japan-China relations, and particularly recently, how there seems to be an improvement in Japan's relationship with China?
Well, first of all, this recent rapprochement, if you may call that, Prime Minister Abe has visited Beijing recently, and President Xi is supposed to reciprocate that. So that's why people are talking about rapprochement. But if you look back 7 or 8 years between Japan and China, the relation has been pretty bad. I would say it was like -10. So what we're doing is elevating it up to maybe 0, +1, -1 zone. So it's not really a rapprochement. But it is getting
Would
better.
you call it more of a return to the mean, I guess?
Yeah, that's how I would categorize it. And before, like early 2000, mid 2000s, there was a big difference between the business community and the foreign policy security community. And the business community saw the possibility of China. And the foreign policy security community saw China as a rising power, which could pose a threat to Japan. But that difference is, I think, converging. Because, the business community always used to talk about the middle class rising in China, and that would change the political culture of China, and then they would converge into a liberal democracy. It may take some time. So that was kind of the roadmap the business community had in mind. But I don't think they see that roadmap anymore. So yes, they still think China as a possibility, but the difference between the two communities, I think, converging. So therefore, the business community is a bit reluctant to totally rely on China, diversifying, their manufacturers like Vietnam, Myanmar. So, how what kind of country China develops into is a big issue for, Japan, I think.
So, and then could you talk a little more about the U.S.-Japan security relationship? Prime Minister Abe has really, I think, pushed the envelope a little bit. And
well, that's, in a way, a very easy one. Because if you're talking about Japan's national security policy, it has to start with the U.S. Japan Alliance. And just think about other options. Right? Like we have a pacifist constitution. Is a pacifist option realistic, viable? I don't think so, because Japan sort of getting rid of arms and all that is very, I think, irresponsible. It's a dangerous decision. It would create a power vacuum. Then what about the other option of Japan going, maybe even nuclear, becoming total, sort of armed power? I don't think that's an option either. The neighbors would not welcome it. Even our friends in Southeast Asia would not welcome it. ROK and China would be just furious about it. And even the Japanese public is not in support of that. And most of all, where's the money? Right? There isn't. So I think that's not going to happen. And there's no regional organization that we can trust. We don't have like NATO type of security organization. And even the Security Council, if something happens in our region, we bring it up to the Security Council, but there's a veto holding power in Asia, which is China. And it may probably be the case that if things really critical happen in the vicinity of Japan, it might sort of relate China. So, the UN Security Council doesn't work either. So then you only have U.S. Japan Alliance. Well, you could think about new alliance with other countries. And we are talking about deepening security ties with other countries. But it's not going to be something that would replace the U.S.-Japan alliance. So therefore, what I always say that Japan is a country without a serious plan B. Right? But it's fortunate that the only option we have is the best option we have. Therefore, Japanese people basically support U.S.-Japan alliance. So if you ask the Japanese people, is U.S.-Japan relations important for Japan? No matter who the president is, even in Trump era, it's like 95% constant, right? And 95% is not a number you usually get in a democracy. So there is, I think, a consensus in Japan on that point.
Well, thank you very much. If we could maybe now turn a little bit to the U.S.-Japan economic relationship. And Satu, in the introduction, there was mention of the project you've been working on, Japan Matters for America, and also Asia Matters for America. But could you comment a little bit overall on the U.S.-Japan economic relationship and maybe point out some of the data that you've been gathering for this project?
Sure. Well, thanks again.
Can you hold the mic?
Forgot about that. Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for being here tonight and for inviting me to participate along with our colleagues. As Bill mentioned, the Japan Matters for America project is an attempt, and it's all interactive on a website, to map out Japan's interactions nationally by every state and every congressional district. I have to say, because of the government shutdown, we're a little bit delayed on the congressional district one-page summaries, but you have the state Kentucky one-page summaries with you. And the message is really quite simple and easy to deliver. We heard the values importance of Japan that Jim started off with. We heard the kind of the security default element that Toshi talked about. I can think of no other relationship, and we have versions of this for Asia, Korea, ASEAN, Australia, India, etc. There is no relationship in the world that the United States has that across the waterfront of security, military, people-to-people, investment, trade, educational and other ties is as wide-ranging, as expansive across both countries, and as deep as the United States-Japan relationship. And that's a simple message. You can get all the details and numbers. Let me just give you, just to flag a couple. Japan is the second largest source of FDI, jobs from FDI in the United States, second only to the UK. But as my Japanese friends always point out, the UK has been around investing in the US a lot longer than Japan has. So it's quite an extraordinary feat, and it's happened particularly over the last 2-3 decades. It's the third largest trade partner. We forget sometimes because of all the talk about China, but Japan and the US together are still approximately a third of the global economy, despite being comparatively small populations, comparatively to India, China, and others. If you look U.S. and Japan people-to-people ties, we have the most sister city relationships of any two countries in the world. And I could go on, and it's not restricted to 5 or 6 states. What's really extraordinary is take Kentucky. Kentucky ranks roughly, give it 26th on population, 28th on GDP, second on per capita trade dependency to GDP ratio. But Japan is either number 1 or top 10 for all of these variables, despite Kentucky ranking in the top third of population and GDP. In other words, the weight of Japan-Kentucky relationship is far greater than the actual numbers for the weight of the state, which tells you how important the relationship is bilaterally. So if you look at numbers for greenfield investment, jobs from investment, trade growth, both services and goods, Japan is a really very important partner for this state. And finally, we didn't mention it, but I think symbolically in the world, the idea that the US and Japan had a very tragic and terrible war and then created a relationship of such robustness of democracy, of values, and of a security alliance, with all its challenges, difficulties of management, which is quite natural, I think stands really as a marker, not only for post-war American diplomacy, but also for the way in which Japan, in 20 years after the war, became an advanced industrial country. We've survived through some pretty difficult times together as nations, particularly on the economic, you raised the issue of economics. I have to say we have difficult trade negotiations, I'm sure, coming up, but my hunch is, my assessment is, these will be far less difficult than they were in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. And the way in which we want to shape both the global system and the regional system, we simply could not do it without Japan. So Japan reforming the World Trade Organization arrangements, for, the regional arrangements being built in Asia for trade, investment, and rules. If we didn't have Japan as a partner, I think the job for both of us and the threats to both of us on the economic front would be far greater. So let me stop there.
And you mentioned trade, and maybe this next question is both for the two of you about, the Trump administration came in and decided to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which had already been reached between Japan and the United States, and instead decided to pursue a more bilateral strategy, focusing on using the threat of imposing tariffs as leverage to negotiate a better agreement. But maybe I'll ask each of you in turn if you can comment, maybe Dr. Nakayama from the Japanese perspective, and then Satu maybe from the US perspective, about how you see the US-Japan trade relationship. Maybe I'll start with you from a Japanese perspective, if you don't mind.
Thank you for that question. TPP was not just a free trade framework. It was more about U.S. and Japan together trying to uphold a high-spec economic order that would uphold regional order. So it wasn't just a free trade. It was more about regional order building. So, and in fact, the Obama administration was saying that they had their Asia-Pacific focus policy, and they've been convincing us that TPP is the pillar of this Asian pivot or the Asian rebalance. So when Mr. Trump came in and he said U.S. is no longer going to sort of uphold the TPP, it was a shock to us, although we knew that it was his constant message during the campaign. He did that like on the first or the second day of his administration. But then what Japan decided to do was that in the U.S. Absence, we would try to uphold TPP without U.S. presence, and together with Australia and New Zealand and some like-minded countries, and try to sustain it. And we have successfully done so in the form of CPTPP, or TPP 11. That's TPP used to be 12 minus US, and it's TPP 11. And this effort has been, very welcomed by the region, as Japan is not well known for its visible, robust leadership. We always say that we're exercising a quiet leadership, but this time around, I think it was very visible. So the message was that, we will try to uphold this norm and order in the U.S. absence. And we will try that. But we cannot do that forever. We need U.S. to come back. And we've been, me and the Japanese government, and everybody basically in Japan, internationalists in Japan, has been trying to convince the American people, the American government, people in the White House, that U.S. has to be a resident power in Asia Pacific. And we're not sure that is, whether U.S. would come back to TPP or not. That's a bit of a different issue. But TPP was the symbol of that. So I think it's really critical that there would be some sort of rethinking within the U.S. Post-Trump, or maybe in the second term. I don't know when, but at least we hope U.S. would engage in that effort.
Okay, wonderful. Satu?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really critical issue. I'd make a couple of points from an American perspective. I think TPP was important for 4 or 5 really big reasons. First of all, to preface it by saying, there is no major trade agreement the United States has ever signed that hasn't gone through heck within our political system, right? You can think of NAFTA, and Ross Perot is the third-party candidate, and the Great Sucking Sound, and all of the rhetoric that ensued. I would note that the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which was just amended slightly in the current administration, was begun negotiations under the George W. Bush administration. It took several years to get through. NAFTA was just renegotiated. So something about trade really gets into our political system in a very complicated way. And on TPP, that's important because President Obama did not move TPP for the first 4 or 5 years while he was in his first term. That began with the 4 parties of Singapore, New Zealand, Brunei and Chile. Chile, that's it. And we really didn't take much action. So that's one. Second, TPP was critical, a rule-based order for China to try to dock onto. In other words, reformers in China were also given an incentive that if you meet these high standards, you can also transform your economy. It wasn't just at China, but it was also premised on the basis that China could be shaped to join a rule-based, high-standard system. Third, the TPP was important because, quite frankly, the biggest amount of regional economic integration that has occurred within Asia. Of course, with U.S. and Asia, but also within Asia. And that's why the multi-party membership the 12 countries was critical because the production and supply chains were depending on a number of parties upholding the high standards and rules. And then finally, most importantly, for this conversation, essentially the TPP allowed us to, if you will, nestle the U.S.-Japan bilateral deal in a multilateral framework, which would have been otherwise hard to do bilaterally. Because Japan was getting benefits from liberalization and high standards and rules with the other 11 parties, it was possible to make certain concessions on agriculture and other things. So that's the importance of TPP. And our political system in 2016 essentially broke down on that. Not just President Trump, who formally removed us, but I just would, as fair analysis, say that the other party and the other candidate also, having been present at the creation, if you will, also pulled back, as did Mr. Sanders. So we don't have consensus. Now, call me a fool. My wife calls me that all the time. I haven't given up on TPP because I have this somewhat odd analytical fantasy that having CPTPP without the U.S. allows more Asian countries to dock onto it while the U.S. is not present. And at some point, we will return to our senses and decide that now that Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, it may take a few years, Korea, Taiwan are in, we absolutely cannot afford to be left out. Again, I have my illusions, but I don't think it's politically impossible because trade has a very complicated trajectory in the American political system. And I think the reality of being cut out, because America has essentially two big goals in the Indo-Pacific region. One, not let it be controlled by a hegemon that keeps us out. And two, not be kept out of the commercial investment trade benefits. If those two things apply to our future national security and economic interests, then we'll have to find some accommodation. And I'm just hopeful that Japan and our colleagues in Asia won't make it too hard for us to dock on when that happens.
No, thank you very much for those comments. We're very fortunate on this panel to have someone, Kevin Smith, who's a good example on a very practical manner of Japanese investments in Kentucky. And I'm wondering, Kevin, if you could talk to us a little bit about the history of Beam Suntory. Maybe you might want to introduce a little bit about Suntory. People may, everyone knows Jim Beam, of course, but talk about the impact that's had on your business with your partnership with the Japanese.
Thank you, Jim, and good evening, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to level set. These two gentlemen to my right are PhDs and doctors, and just to set expectations, I also have an abbreviation after my name. It's MD, but that's for Master Distiller. So recognize that I am a bourbon producer, and we'll go as deep as I can, especially with whiskey. But thank you. My role in the company today is I'm the Vice President of Beam Bourbon Affairs, which essentially means I do a lot of the customer or consumer public affairs for the company. It allows me to be involved in a lot of different things because a lot of the topics they're discussing today are actually big parts of the Kentucky Chamber of GLI and all the different business organizations that are out here, the commerce focus. Suntory actually became a big part of Kentucky's footprint in 2014. I remember where I was. I live in Bardstown, Kentucky, and I was at Mammy's restaurant having breakfast with a couple of my colleagues when the announcement came over our phones, and we all kind of like looked at each other. What does this mean? At the time, we didn't really know, but it actually turned out to be one of the best, I guess I'll call it an acquisition because that's what it was, that we could have had. And the reason being is that Suntory as a company had been around, and it has been around since 1899. It's a large company, it's a large holding company. They're big into beverage things. Most of their business, 57% of it, is non-alcoholic. So if you go to Japan, you'll see a lot of their products. And don't ask me to list them all, but I know that water's one of the big ones. They have coffees. That's the Boss. And so it's really good. But also then about 33% of their business is beer, wine, and spirits. This merger that was about a $16 billion merger was a good investment for us. It made us, as they had Japanese whiskeys as well, they rolled all that up underneath our company, which is known as Beam Suntory. third largest spirits company in the world, Diageo being the first, Pernod Ricard. Now, Suntory makes those two companies look very small when you look at who they are. And I just can't speak to, if you fly to Japan, you'll see on the airlines, they're talking about Suntory whiskeys, they'll have Suntory waters. It's a very, all the Pepsi distribution in Japan is through Suntory, and even have Pepsi distribution on the eastern seaboard. There are 51 companies in the United States owned by Suntory. So it's a large company, just to give you that perspective. They have 38,000 employees, $23 billion in sales, and I believe it was 2017. They were number 5 Fortune World's Most Admired Food and Beverage Company. So it's a great thing for Kentucky to have Suntory here. Now, I'll continue on for a second about the interesting piece for Jim Beam and our company, Beam Suntory, is a whiskey company. We're the #1 bourbon company in the world. So not only do we have Jim Beam, but we've got Maker's Mark, which is run by the Samuels family, but it fits into our portfolio. Other brands that you might recognize would be Knob Creek, Basil Hayden's, Booker's, Baker's, just to mention a few, Old Crow, Old Grandad, just the list goes on. We also have Scotch whiskeys. We're #1 in the Isla whiskeys. So if you know Lefroy, that's one of the ones that's out there. Japanese whiskeys. We have the world's best Japanese whiskeys. Yamazaki, which is in the sister city. I was looking at the brochure, and I guess would have to turn yours over. Frankfurt is a sister city with I say that correctly, Shimamoto, if I said that correct. That's where our Yamazaki distillery is located. And in Frankfurt, we have the Old Grandad plant, our largest bottling facility in the world. So it was a result of this merger that allowed those two cities to become sister cities, and that's still growing. But the most important piece that I want to talk about a little bit more, and we can go down the list of questions that you probably have, but is the cultural impact that's been so positive for our company. The Japanese culture, as we've come to learn, is about the future. It's about a long extension of the future, which is perfect for our business because most of the products, if anyone's having a bourbon tonight, by the way, that's Old Forester, that's owned by Brown-Forman, not ours, but it's still a good bourbon. The long play is very important because all of our products are aged for multiple years, and so are Japanese whiskeys, and so is the heritage of our company and the founding members of both the Suntory Company and the Beams and the Samuels and all of these different things. And so when these two companies came together, you could sense the energy that was tied to this. Suntory has a great message, which is living, creating harmony between people and nature. And if you extend that out, you can just see how this would be very important for a company like ours who's very interested in, we've been around since 1795, and a company like this is going to help us be around for the next 200 years and beyond. So I'll stop there and let you ask some questions if you want to go into any more of that detail.
Could you talk about what impact has that had on your ability to market in Japan?
It was dramatic. 2012, we sold about 30,000 cases of Jim Beam. 2018, we sold 830,000 cases of Jim Beam. So the routes to market are huge in our industry, and that's why tariffs should be discussed at some point tonight, and as these gentlemen have already brought up. But that investment in our ability to impact, we actually, as far as our company, we have 3 basic regions. 40% of Beam Suntory's business, so when you think about our sales, we have tequilas, we have vodkas, we have rums, and in addition to our bourbons, 44% is sold here in the United States. If you kind of take the Asian, European country mass, that's going to be mostly Europe, though, about 22%. 34% of our business is in Japan. So it's been a great relationship from the standpoint of taking bourbons, exporting bourbons into Japan, but also the ability to take Japanese whiskeys to the world. Now, there is a Japanese whiskey crisis, if you haven't heard. For those of you that are familiar with Yamazaki or Hibiki, yes, they're really good products. The problem is it takes a while for that to age, and so they're trying to, the same thing we have with bourbon is they're trying to put it down, but right now it's hard to find those products, and supply and demand comes into play, and these gentlemen will tell you, when supply goes down, demand goes up, what happens to the price? All those students out there, what happens to the price? Goes up, right? So that could be a good thing, but it's also a bad thing from the standpoint of we've invested a lot in marketing and in these routes of market, and so you don't really get that return on those investments as quickly.
Now, you mentioned the impact of tariffs, and I think one of the challenges of recent U.S. trade policy where we impose tariffs on others as a leverage, but then often, Japan has not done this, but most of our other trading partners retaliate by imposing tariffs on U.S. products, and it seems like spirits often tend to be the target. But could you comment a little bit on the impact
I can. We've had a lot of people say, well, let me say first, we kind of think it's a little cool. We used to, we never got mentioned in any of these tariff stuff, and all of a sudden, they're putting tariffs on bourbon, man. We must be a big deal, But the reality is it's because of Mitch McConnell and our relationship of his leadership and such. So we call them retaliatory tariffs. And the reality is steel and some of these other things are the big economic drivers. Bourbon tends to be something of significance because of how it's known and how it's related to us. The reality of people saying it doesn't impact our business because they still continue to see our growth, and we are experiencing some phenomenal growth. What they need to understand is it's also about cash flow, because we based our markets going into there and actually selling, and it's going to be millions of dollars that we lose as a result of prices going up. And we don't take price. It's not the right strategy for our company to go into these markets now and say, all right, we'll raise our prices to offset that, because it will kill the volume and all the work that's gone into it. Tariffs in Europe are a bigger concern for us than in China, just because it's the size of where our distribution is, as you heard me kind of share the numbers. And even with Canada, I was in Canada recently on a Kentucky Chamber trip, as a mission trip as we called it, and I had the pleasure of meeting Prime Minister Trudeau, and someone made it work out. Our ambassador to Canada, who's still our ambassador, who's now the potential UN ambassador, Ambassador Kraft, was able to help me get in front of Trudeau and actually present him with a bottle of Jim Beam Single Barrel and a bottle of Maker's 46. He actually had just turned 46, and I created 46, so it all kind of worked out. And I was handing it to him. He said, well, I had one of these last night, and I happened to just kind of whisper in his ear, like, well, if you keep these tariffs up, it's going to be hard to get these to you, so you need to lower those tariffs. But Canada obviously is a good trading partner, and we watch those things. But we need those tariffs to go away, because tariffs, we want level playing field. And I think the tariffs are probably being used in some regards back and forth to try and level that field by our government. We would like to see them go away immediately if we could do anything to help that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to questions from the audience. I should mention that earlier today some of us were at the University of Louisville, and I was very impressed by the number of questions and good questions we got from the students there. So I'm hoping that you as an audience will not be any less than the students are in terms of asking good questions. I think we have a mic going around, so if you have a question right here, if you could raise your hand, I'll recognize you, and then please wait for the microphone to come. And if you wouldn't mind, before the question, stating your name and your affiliation, and then mention who you're directing the question to on the panel. So who'd like to be first? Yes, back here in the corner. So,
Hi, I'm Robert Brown. I'm president of the Japan Society of Kentucky, and it's for really all three of y'all. Well, what's the reaction of Japan to the China Brick and Road initiative, and what's the thinking in Japan?
Initially, we thought the Belt and Road Initiative was a tool to expand Chinese hegemony. Right? We saw it as a sort of like an empire-building project. So we were extremely cautious about it. And also, there's the AIIB side of things. So if you see AIIB and Belt and Road Initiative together, I guess the initial reaction was that we would not participate. We would maybe not interfere, but at least not sort of, get on board and warn others that this could be dangerous. But I think as it sort of BRI actually sort of developed into an actual project, there are aspects that I'm not saying that what China is doing is everything is bad. There are something that they're doing good. And infrastructure building is definitely needed in our region. So when there is a possibility where we could do things together, and if that would result in a positive outcome, we would cooperate. So we have sort of toned down the cautious rhetoric. And so when there's a possibility, we would cooperate. So that, I think it has turned to a rather a pragmatic mode. And that sort of go hands in hand with the rapprochement that we talked before.
Yeah, on the U.S. side, the AIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the BRI, which led to these terms I use, but you know, if you say the words out, BRI and led to something called the Belt and Road Forum, or BARF, and it gets very complicated and unappealing very quickly. But I think the U.S. had essentially 3 or 4 concerns. One, would the financing structure, meaning the AIB, the Infrastructure Investment Bank, have the transparency, the global norms and standards for lending, and the proper procedures that are followed in international institutions such as the U.S. and Japan role in the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank? Concern 1. Concern 2, would the financing structure that China had for building these projects in countries primarily in Southeast and South Asia lead to excessive debt burdens on these countries? And at least in a couple of cases, the empirical evidence is the debt burden was excessive. So, for example, there's a port in Sri Lanka called Hambantota, which was financed by the Chinese, and the debt was so significant, it was signed by previous Prime Minister, Mr. Rajapaksa, and led to such excessive debt that eventually part of that port terminal was signed over to China in a 99-year lease, which might be termed a kind of neo-colonialism or infrastructure colonialism. And you also had, after the new government was elected in Malaysia, another second case where the new government of Mr. Mahathir, who came back, 81-year-old new prime minister, or did I, 91, forgive me, 91. And he canceled a couple of projects also because they were done under his previous leader, Prime Minister Najib, who accidentally had $600 million in his personal bank account and discovered it, which has not occurred in my checking account ever. But I mention that because these are the kinds of concerns. Now, what Toshi said is exactly right. The need for infrastructure is a crying need in the region. We estimate, World Bank, ADB, all kinds of studies have been done. Let's call it $10 trillion. So if China is willing to do it, I think the issue is debt ratio, the transparency, and the sustainability. And the other final problem, and I was just in the Philippines and Southeast Asia this past week, 2 weeks ago, is Chinese workers coming in. So many of these projects bring in labor from outside, which has all kinds of social and local political consequences. So if we can avoid those, there's nothing wrong intrinsically with China building infrastructure. China builds roads, helps develop economies, create middle classes. This can be a very good and positive thing. But it is the terms under which it's done and what the political quid pro quo, if you will, is. And that's why, again, to bring it back to the U.S.-Japan relationship, the U.S. and Japan are now working, along with Australia and other partners, on other efforts to bring their leverage of their financing, their transparency, and their rules together to provide alternative sources of financing and assistance, including through the U.S. Build Act. So those would be my U.S. sort of reflections.
Robert, good to see you. I don't really have a comment about that, but I will tell you about a new product that we're launching. And actually, it's going to come out this weekend. It's called Legion. I won't tell you too much about it, but it's a collaboration. It's a Kentucky bourbon between our Japanese master blender and our master distiller, Fred No. Our CEO, Tak of Suntory, Tak Niami-san, as I know him, was in New York today just announcing that. So hopefully once you guys get all that stuff figured out, they can celebrate with our new East meets West product.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you. Okay, what's another question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Alana Turner. I'm with Greater Louisville, Inc., and I was just curious if you could speak a little bit more about the establishment of sister cities and what their purpose is with the Japan-America Alliance.
Thank you. Maybe Satu, shall I start with you, and then I might add in if you have anything you'd like.
Sure, please. There is a Sister City International Group, which is the NGO that runs the overall network. We collaborate very closely with them on some of the data set that we produce. Let me be very frank. Sister cities are difficult to pin down because they come from, as you said, a relationship that was built because of a merger of two companies. So there is no common necessary origin point, purpose, and activity level of sister cities. What we have found is that there are three kinds of sister relationships, essentially. There are prefectural level state, there are city, and there are other county or local. And we categorize them. You can look at the list of, I believe, 436 at last count, but I may have that number wrong. And they reflect all kinds of personal ties, educational ties, corporate and commercial ties, and some are more active than others. But what they do most fundamentally are three things. First, they create the people-to-people connections that didn't exist without them. Second, they provide a platform for building commercial and trade and other investment relations because people get to know each other's communities, etc. And third, they're very important for cultural reasons. And finally, in cases of crisis and others, we talk about high politics and security, and Ambassador Zumwalt was so critical to our country's response and cooperation with Japan after the terrible earthquake and tsunami disaster. But I would note that one of the largest networks that was important for raising funding from the private sector in America was these sister city relationships. And they came together in varieties of ways and different methods to raise funding to support the recovery and other efforts. So my point is, in all of these ways the sister cities work, and tying them to specific deals or tying them to a governor's visit or a mayor's visit for, as you say, a commercial mission, you'd have to look at each one, but that's what we find to be the general case for the case that one would make for having these kind of relationships.
If I could, thank you very much, and I agree with you that one of the real benefits of sister city ties are the people-to-people relations. And let me just give you one concrete example. In Japan, there's a very rural county at the base of Mount Fuji called Yatsugatake in Yamanashi Prefecture, and they have had a sister county relationship with a county in eastern Kentucky, I think it's Franklin County, for the last 50 years. And this particular relationship stemmed from a missionary who came from Kentucky to this part of rural Japan, and after the war, when that region was very poor, he began collecting used clothing on the U.S. military base and driving up and distributing it to people who needed that, and he became very involved in this community. And now the county in Japan has every year a Kentucky County Fair, and it's a huge event. It draws about 100,000 people, mostly from Tokyo. And they bring a delegation. It's on the Kentucky side, it's Eastern Kentucky University that's kind of houses the activity. But when I went to visit this, I was amazed. There was a cooper there demonstrating making oak barrels for the bourbon industry. There was a blacksmith who showed how he shoes horses and giving rides on the horse to the kids. There were musicians. There was a choir from the local high school. And these people from Kentucky came and spent about 3 weeks living with the Japanese host family. And then the reverse was the Yatsugatake County sent high school kids to live with a family in Kentucky for a few weeks. And this all started that a missionary had developed with that community. But now he's long since deceased, but that tie goes on because of the relationship between Japanese and American counterparts. So this replicated, several hundred times. How many sister city relationships did you say there are?
Open up the book and be caught
Okay,
out.
but in the hundreds, I think it's fair to say,
Oh, yeah.
is just a good example of why these ties really can matter in terms of providing a foundation at the people-to-people level of a strong U.S.-Japan relationship.
450.
450.
Over 450 that we've cataloged, and that you can go online and go into every U.S. state and see its counterpart in the online version.
So thanks very much. And by the way, one of Satu's former employees, a woman named Grace Clegg, just came into the Foreign Service. She's a Japanese speaker, but her initial interaction with Japan was a sister city tie. Her sister in, I think it was Michigan, was it?
Right,
had a relationship with Japan, and they had a high school exchange program, and that was the beginning of her interest in Japan. So these kinds of relationships really do spark interest on the part of young people that really form a foundation for a strong relationship.
And Miss, if I could just refer, Sasakawa USA on its website has Grace's study on the sister city relationship. She did a study for Sasakawa investigating the dynamics in nature. So if you're interested further in this issue, please go online and get that study, or I'd be happy to send it to you.
Thank you. Another question? Oh, in the back here. Okay, then we'll go to you next.
Just to keep on this theme, I'm president of Sister Cities of Louisville,
Wonderful. Thank you for your work with the sister cities.
and we would be very interested in talking to any of you about an economic, educational, cultural link with a Japanese sister city.
Great.
Another question that I have, I work for JCPS as a World Language Instructional Lead. We have 3 schools that teach Japanese, and I'm wondering what advice you might give to those teachers or those students about furthering their interest and their careers with language and other areas, economics, whatever, in their studies.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. Maybe others can. But as we've tried to demonstrate through this, but also the one-page handout for Kentucky, Japan is a really important partner for the state and for the nation as a whole, but for the state. So I guess I would tell teachers and students that, flavors of language and countries kind of come in and out of the cool portfolio, but Japan's depth of engagement with the United States and with Kentucky would seem to me, if someone is looking for both a commercial career, a linguistic career, a foreign service career, learning Japanese would be a really step up to a lot of career paths. So it's not, it's very practical, and it's very useful in terms of a variety of vectors they could pursue in their life, in professional and personal life.
Did you want to add anything?
Maybe I shouldn't be saying this, right? But, there was a Chinese language hype couple of years ago, right? But Chinese people are much more better English speaker than the Japanese are. So you study Chinese, but you learn that Chinese side would speak English. But so your Chinese would make sense. But in case of Japan, we're not known for our English ability, right? So not many people speak fluent English. Therefore, it does create a job opportunity if you speak Japanese. Because if you want to do business with Japan, you definitely have to be able to speak Japanese. In case of China, maybe you can do that with English. But half joking, but half, I think, true.
And if I might add, just in my short period of time of getting to know members of my company, I would encourage you, and I don't know how we could even make this relationship happen, but have Japanese people meet these students, because it's beyond, it's not just the words, it's the actual person and the culture, and there's so much more about, it's a very rich culture and heritage and honor, which obviously you can teach, but until you get to know somebody from Japan, and even business people, and there's enough business, there's 191 businesses, Japan-owned businesses in Kentucky. So I think maybe one of the things the school system, if they could really make those cultural relationships stronger, not just a language. I agree with you. We are always looking for people that speak Japanese, but what we find is when our colleagues from Japan come here, they want to work on their English. So.
Okay, thank you. I think we had a question over here, yes. Sorry, the mic is coming just behind you there.
Hi, my name is Shivani, and not really affiliated to anything. I did my PhD in Japan, lived there for 13 years, and Louisville is now my home for the last 10 years. I have a comment and a question. And the comment is, I really enjoyed your talk, Mr. Nakayama. I loved your tongue-in-cheek remarks about the strategic hugging. I'm from India, and I think that's what India is looking at with China. As a political relationship. With Mr. Kevin, when I was in Japan last year, with my husband, we visited Suntory and he gave a talk. He's a scientist. I went through the brochure, the Japanese brochure, and it was very impressive as to how much products there are besides the drinks and the beverages that are used, made from the byproducts of the distillery and made into medical foods, nutraceuticals. And I was wondering, it might be confidential, but do you have any plans to work with Japan in developing such products, which would be also very, useful for the American market?
Well, I can't speak to what that might look like, but I will add to that. Suntory is a much broader company than just a beverage company. They have health foods, if you will, vitamins and things, and health drinks. They have an intense research and development. I've visited the Suntory R&D and the level of studies that they have going on. Just to give you, they also do ice cream, Haagen-Dazs ice cream, but they are known, also Suntory created the first blue rose, which is the genetic crossing and breeding to actually get a true blue rose. If you've seen blue roses, typically they're colored. They're white roses that have been colored. So to your point, that's one of the wealths of being tied to a company like this is a lot of our discussions extend beyond just the beverage distribution, beverage alcohol production, or any beverage. So I don't have anything to add to that as far as what you asked, but who knows, maybe someday.
I think we had another question, yes, over here.
Hi, Dr. Jason Abbott from University of Louisville, Center for Asian Democracy. I have a variation on a couple of questions and then a specific question about Kentucky. So the first one is there a concern that once the China-US trade dispute is settled, that the next target may be Japan in terms of the trade deficit that the United States has with Japan? Related to that, what can Japan do to convince the United States to return to the TPP? And finally, the Kentucky-specific question is, what can Kentucky do to attract more Japanese investment beyond the automobile sector that has been very successful in attracting investment?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, that's a hard one. It seems like the trade negotiation with China, with the meeting between the two presidents in late March, would more or less, I don't know if it's the word is settled down, but maybe it's going to move on to the next phase. And we are worried. And the USTR, which is involved in that negotiation, is a very small office, right? So they're now preoccupied with China. So the negotiation with China is more or less over. There's a fear on our side that they would start focusing on us. And in fact, Lighthizer, who is in charge of the negotiation, has said clearly that next is Japan. Right? So there are worries. And if things come to tariffs on automobiles, I think it's going to create a huge difficulty on our side because automobile industry is not just a industry. It's like the backbone of Japanese manufacturing. So I said in this afternoon's session at the university, there's no anti-Americanism in Japan right now, a viable one. But the trade issue when it goes to the tariffs on cars and all that, I think the sentiment towards not the U.S. as a whole, but Trump administration and its trade policy would, I think, turn to negative. We hope that would not happen, but it's all unpredictable, and it seems like Mr. Trump and his trade negotiating team is very sort of focused and fixed in pursuing that objective. So we don't know how we can sort of, divert that. And if you have any idea, I would love to hear it, your advice, and please advise the Japanese government.
If I could just add something about Japan's trade strategy related to what the U.S. has been doing. It's been very different from the strategy that other trading partners like the European Union, Canada, or other countries have adopted, in the sense that Japan has not imposed retaliatory tariffs as have the EU or China or others. Instead, I call that kind of a karate strategy. You put a tariff on me, I'll put one back on you. And so it's using force with force. And what Japan has adopted is more of a judo strategy, is using your opponent's strength to your advantage. And so what Japan has done, rather than imposing more trade restrictions on the U.S., Japan has instead pursued further trade liberalization with our trading partners. So as Dr. Nakayama mentioned, instead of walking away from TPP, Japan said, we're going to continue this negotiation. And now the agreement has come into force. 7 of the 11 countries have ratified. So tariff reductions are occurring. Likewise, Japan concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union, its other major trading partner. That agreement came into force, or it's coming into force, I guess, April 1st. So what is the impact on the United States? Well, one of our big exports to Japan is beef. We export over $1 billion a year of beef to Japan. And one of the big competitors is Australia. So now Japan has negotiated reduction of beef tariffs on Australian imports, but since the U.S. walked away, we don't take advantage of that. So in January, Japanese beef imports from Australia went up 80%. And that will continue, I think, as long as the U.S. doesn't have a free trade agreement with Japan. So over time, companies react to market signals, and over time, U.S. Exporters will lose their distribution networks to their competitors. Another big export we have with Japan is pork. Our big competitors are with the European Union, Spain, and Denmark, and so forth. And I'm sure when the Japanese tariff cuts against European pork come into effect, you'll start seeing a surge of European exports and a decline of American exports. So, in other words, Japan is imposing a penalty, but they're doing it by saying, we're moving ahead, and if you choose not to move ahead, you'll be left behind. But it's I think, quite a brilliant strategy, actually. And I think what you'll start seeing is more and more pressure on the U.S. government by these exporters who fear loss of market share, with even ultimately, if we negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan, there will be a time penalty imposed on U.S. exporters because our competitors are already getting those benefits. So we'll have to see, but perhaps that's one way in which there'll be more pressure put on the United States to come back to the table and start looking at trade liberalization again. Your other question, though, is about how can Kentucky attract more investment from Japan. Does anyone from the panel want to talk about that issue?
I can speak to that from a different perspective. I think it is the state government, our economic development, Secretary Gill, we're doing so much in the state to make this a business-friendly state. And you'll hear everything from red tape reduction to right to work and all these different policies to create a business-friendly atmosphere. The real commodity, I think, that is going to be a key piece, and we don't know much about this from the standpoint it doesn't get as much press as it should, but there are some incredible things happening in our workforce. We have a workforce crisis. I think the thing that will make our state, our Commonwealth, one of the leading attractors for companies, specifically maybe Japan because of the connection of what they do in automotive, is the work that's being done through the state, but more importantly at the local level. If I can just comment about JCPS, and if you haven't read much about the academies and what's going on there, there's this engagement between business and what I'll call the talent pipeline education groups, whether that's high schools, community colleges, or post-secondary. And I believe what you'll see, and the problem is it's like bourbon, it takes a while for it to mature out of the system. But one of the things that will be a great attractor is that we have a strong, talented, diverse, technically advanced if you will, workforce. Now, I say that on the promise of I'm involved in a lot of the workforce areas, whether it's GLI or the Kentucky Chamber or the Governor's Workforce Innovation Board, but what I see happening are some incredible, innovative ideas to solve these issues. We are one of the few states that actually has an official TPM, Talent Pipeline Management System, that's gathering data. This is the key. Businesses are working with educators to get the root cause and get the right data so that we're training people in the right way and not just saying that we need to do it, we're backing it up with data. So I'll stop there if anyone wants to add to that.
Jim, just one thing on Professor Abbott's question. I was thinking your two questions about how to handle it. One thing that didn't go mentioned, we talked about the administration and Lighthizer, which I think is critical, and Japan is, of course, next up for trade talks. I think there are a couple other things to watch for. One is the September 26 joint statement that announced these talks is a sort of a masterpiece of diplomatic finesse about what the talks are about. So I think exactly what the talks are about when they get launched is going to be an important thing to watch and what coverage there's. The second thing is, I'm always mindful of our political calendars, both here and in Japan. Japan is a democracy and has elections. It's got upper house elections, it's got future transitions of Mr. Abe as prime minister, et cetera, et cetera. And we, of course, have 2020, and we're off and running, right? So one thing I'm very mindful in the current trade context is whatever the administration has on the trade front and the new majority in the House are not wildly unaligned or misaligned on trade. Indeed, the majority Democrats have many misgivings about trade that are shared with the administration. In fact, Mr. Schumer in the Senate has complained that on the China front, the administration did not label China a currency manipulator. And I can see currency coming into play, for example, in the U.S. Japan talks. And given the way in which the dynamics of our 14, as of today anyway, I last counted 14 candidates on the Democratic side, could be more by now. Has it increased? Okay. The point is that because of the more anti-trade element of the party, you might see a harsher rhetoric in the Congress as they go through. So that leads to your second question, what strategy? Well, the judo strategy is brilliant, but two other things. I shouldn't say this, but if I were a Japanese trade official, I might want to let these talks drag out as long as possible, because it may be difficult to finish, because they have to go up to the hill, right, if there's a new trade agreement. So that could be one strategy apart from judo. And you mentioned the EU FTA, but I'm very conscious that Japan seems to also, from my recent trips in Southeast Asia, also pushing very hard to two other things. Finishing RCEP, this regional comprehensive economic partnership, which includes 10 Southeast Asian countries, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. It's the 10+6. And inviting new people to dock on to CPTPP, particularly Thailand, because the production and supply chain of Japan in Southeast Asia is heavily centered on Thailand. And Thailand is not in CPTPP. And I think Japan would like to avoid moving stuff from China because of tariffs into Vietnam only, and also get Thailand in so that those preferences could apply to Thailand. So that complements the judo strategy. So I think that's what I see in the American political process for the next year. There's not wide gap between the administration on getting these deficits cut and this, judo plus strategy of Japan, as well as perhaps lengthening out the negotiating timeline.
On your question about attracting investment to Kentucky, I have some good news and some bad news for you. And the good news is that there are lots of Japanese companies. Suntory is a great example, but there are many, many others who have capital, and they're looking where they want to invest that capital to maximize returns. And they see the United States as an attractive place. We're a growing economy, a growing population. Japanese existing investments are doing well, so we have a track record. So there will be lots of Japanese investment coming to the United States. That's the good news. The bad news for you is Kentucky's not the only state that wants to attract Japanese investment. So investors are going to look around and they're going to pick the best place they can to invest in. So to be honest, you have to be better than everyone else. So issues like workforce development is a good example. Having a good business climate is a good example. Another one I would mention is relationships. And when I talk with Japanese investors in Japan and ask them, why did you invest in Georgia instead of South Carolina? Or why did you invest here instead of there? Often what they would say is, we have relationships with the governor. We have relationships with the Economic Development Office, so we're comfortable investing there. We know there's going to be challenges. A big investment will result in some issues, so we have friends that we can go to work those things out. So in addition to the things you mentioned, I would encourage the state government and local governments here to develop relationships with Japanese companies, and you'll, I think, see investment flowing then into Kentucky. Do you want to add to that?
I just want to remind you that Kentucky does have bourbon, Jim, so we have
Okay,
that.
you have a comparative advantage. That's
So we have an
wonderful.
advantage,
Okay.
yes.
I'm mindful, speaking of bourbon, we're going to have a sake tasting, and I think we're just about having time up. I know it's not good to keep a discussion about some heavy-duty political issues when there's good alcohol to be consumed. So maybe I'll turn to the panelists for one last time. Do you have a final comment you want to make? Maybe Kevin, I'll start with you, and we'll just go down this way.
And come back that way. So one of the things I do want to mention is that Suntory's brought to us a great culture of quality, Monozukuri as they call it, but they also brought a culture of giving back, and we call it growing for good within the communities where employees live and work, growing for good within nature and protecting our water sources, which are so critical. Life and water are hand in hand. But as we conclude this tonight, we go to the sake tasting, we go back and we have more beverages. One of the other things is growing for good in the areas of social responsibility. And I just want to promote the idea that, you should drinksmart.com if you want to check that out. But our products are designed to be enjoyed responsibly. As most Kentuckians know, good Kentuckian enjoys his good Kentucky bourbon in a responsible manner. So enjoy tonight, and thank you for your time.
Well, just to, first of all, to thank the World Affairs Council and colleagues here, and of course Sasakawa, with whom we work very closely. I hope the Japan Matters for America and America Matters for Japan project will be useful to you. I urge you to take a look at the website. And just one advertisement, if you have a story, and as you'll see from the site, has a lot of articles and connection stories. If you have an article or about an initiative, a cultural link, educational or commercial story, and I mentioned this at the university too, and you want a byline for your organization or for yourself, we welcome contributions, no more than about 500 words, photos are great, to put on our site, because this is a tool that we use to engage mayors, local officials, governors, and of course the U.S. Japan Caucus on Capitol Hill, which comprises members of Congress and senators. So we'd be delighted to take a look at those. But again, thank you for your time and interest in the U.S. Japan relationship.
Well, thank you simply for coming here and listen to our views and what we talk. And since I teach American politics, American foreign policy back in Japan, I need to sort of immerse myself into the American culture and political culture. And I've been hunting and doing a lot of things. I've been going to churches. But the one thing I haven't done is, immerse myself in March Madness. Right? So I'm going to root for a team in Kentucky. I'm not going to say which. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. You've been a great audience. I really appreciate your interest in foreign affairs, and certainly I want to thank the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and the World Affairs Council, Bill Clifford, for your support for this program. Thank you all very much. You've been a great audience.
So first of all, I want to thank all of our panelists and speakers, and we just have a really small token of appreciation for you to give you, so you will remember us by. And Kevin, next time we might be able to include one of those Beam Suntory samples in here. We should talk, but that's not in there this time. But please, for us. And I also wanting to take this opportunity to introduce our Board of Directors Board Chair, Dr. Otto McRobbie, who's going to give us closing remarks.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the panel first, and since I have the podium, I'll say a few words. You know, please sit down. Well, as the chair of the board of the World Affairs Council in Kentucky and Southern Indiana, I want to thank you all. And I had a comment that related to what I heard. Because in my real job, I'm a professor of computer engineering, computer science, and director of industrial research and innovation at the University of Louisville. And what I'm working right now is how to increase the talent pipeline. I'm working with Louisville Forward and other things, and we're challenged to increase the talent pipeline. So we are working, actually, I give myself a deadline to my boss. By Friday, I'm giving them a plan. So we're trying to quintuple the computer and tech talent in 5 years. So we need some investment from the government and from the city and the industry, but we're working on a plan. And that's very important to grow Louisville and to grow Kentucky. So we're very happy with what we see from the state in investment in workforce development, and that's how we all grow together. So that's on my other hat. I visited Japan and I loved it. And one of the interesting things about Japan is a book that stays in my mind, The Japan That Can Say No, which is currently not the policy, but it still remains in my mind about the strength of Japan. And regardless of what the Japanese government does, everybody knows that Japan can say no, but they choose not to. And that's, I think, a very important lesson for us here to understand how we can deal positively in people who can restrain themselves from their power. And I think this is something we all have to appreciate. Anyway, I want to make sure that we recognize that we have high school students who are part of our Global Citizen Certificate. Can you stand up? This is the future of Kentucky, and we're glad to have them here. Thank you so much. We also want to recognize our staff, and we have interns and staff. Some of them are new, and I want to recognize them because without them, we are very efficient, very kind of relatively very efficient in staffing. I want to recognize their efforts. Please stand up. Oh, they're already standing. They are already standing. And obviously, as a nonprofit, we have board members and former board members. I also realize that some of them are here and former chairs of the board. And I want to recognize them and thank them all. Please stand. Essentially, we had a very active board that's very involved, and this is my last term as board chair, so I want to make sure that, and we have the new chair in here. If he can stand to be recognized. Come on. Jan will assume the board leadership in July, and we're happy to have him and have him involved. Okay. Other than that, if you are not wearing a badge with your name, you're wearing a paper badge, means you are not a member. And if you are not a member, we really want you to be a member. And we love you all, but we'd love to have you in our family more formally. And there are many membership levels. And membership is what makes the organization more strong and reaches out to the whole community. Your presence is appreciated. And if that's how you choose to be, you're still always welcome. But we'd love to have you join us and be a member, okay? I will not push for that too much. We're working on, maybe next time, this will look different. I will not tell you how. We're working on a lot of great things, and we have a lot of activities, like we have the pop-up series, so we have one coming soon. I will not tell you the topic, so keep an eye on what we send you and our website. And we have our actually very interesting series that's been very popular, which is what? Anyone knows what's our new very popular thing, particularly with younger people? Trivia. Global trivia. Global trivia is becoming a very popular thing. And what we love about it is it gets people together. And the teams work and compete and about things related to the world. Maybe we'll have one focused on Japan. Also, I want to make sure we thank our Japanese intern, Ayako, and Laura here, who is her host family. Laura, you have to be recognized, and which gave her an immersive experience here, I think, from what I observed. I know, I've observed that. Yes, and Ayako is gonna kind of be our host for the sake tasting, and I hope that you will all stay around and enjoy the sake. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
I'm very glad that I could hear such inspiring, insightful, and informative presentations from today's panelists. After such excellent discussions, I don't know how much more I could offer, but I would like to suggest we all raise our glasses in gratitude, and we thank all the panelists for sharing their instructive thoughts. So if you could join, please, please, raise your glasses and say thank you for thank you to all the panelists. So thank you very much. And over the past 9 months, since first arriving in Nashville as Consul General, I have visited many communities all across the 5 states region that our office covers, namely Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And for the purposes of enhancing understanding between our 2 countries, supporting local grassroots exchanges, and so on. Coming to Kentucky has always been a privilege thanks to the many partners and friends of Japan, such as the Japan-American Society of Kentucky, the World Affairs Council, and also the Kentucky government. Further, I personally thank Sasakawa USA for supporting today's event. Without this event, I couldn't have visited Louisville, the bourbon capital of the world, for the first time this evening. I am very happy that I can make many new friends and also taste some Japanese sake here at the beautiful Speed Art Museum. I spoke with Governor Bevin 2 weeks ago during a reception hosted by our Ambassador Sugiyama. The ambassador invited to the reception governors attending the National Governors Association meeting in Washington, D.C., as well as executives from Japanese companies in the United States. What I witnessed during the reception, the Governor Bevin was fantastic because he didn't eat anything. He didn't drink anything. He just kept talking to the Japanese businessman to attract their interest in Kentucky. So I really admired his effort, and also I sensed the legend of the Kentucky governors who inherit from his predecessors. And during the conversation, during his conversation with a Japanese businessman, he introduced me to the Japanese businessman as his consul general. His consul general. I cannot know how and how much he expects me to do, but I have been feeling pressure ever since. So I think now maybe the time for me to drink more bourbon and sake. Thank you very much.